We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hello, everyone. We are happy to have you guys back here today. My name is Kara Oostros, and I'm a field editor with Real Agriculture. As I said, thank you for joining us for the School of Public Policy's Simpson Center for Agricultural and Food Innovation and Public Education. We are here for the Urban and Rural Farms Marrying Sustainability and Efficiency webinar. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, a few housekeeping items just to get us started here. If you have to leave early, recordings of this webinar will be posted on the school's website and also on our YouTube page. Recordings of all our past webinars can be found on our YouTube page. So there's been a lot of great conversations up to this point. Be sure to go check those out as well. We will have time for a Q&A after the presentation and panel. We just do ask that you enter your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will pose them to your speakers. However, we do understand that, there's oftentimes things come up and you have questions as they are being talked about. So, of course, put them in the Q&A box as you think of them, and we will we'll pose them as soon as we can as well. If there are any specific questions you have for any of our specific panelists, please let us know, and I'll make sure that we pose them to the correct panelists. Without further ado, today's panelists are Margot Hurlbert, who is the Canada Research Chair in Climate Change, Energy and Sustainability Policy at the University of Regina, Roland Kroebel, who is a research scientist with Agriculture and Agrifood Canada in Lethbridge, Alberta, Robert McDougall, who is a postdoctorate associate, the School of Environmental and Rural Sciences at the University of New England in Australia, and Nathan Pelletier, who is the Ag Farmers of Canada Industrial Research Chair in Sustainability at UBC. Today's panelists will discuss greenhouse gas emissions and the lessons to be learned from small-scale, organic and urban farms that can help Canadian producers as they navigate the approach they take on their farms and the complex nature of the trade-offs facing our ag industry. As I said, any questions, we are here. This is kind of the best part about being live. Of course, you can watch it recorded later, but if you're live with us here now, send in your questions and we'll be happy, as your moderator, I'll be happy to get them across to our panelists. So to start us off here today, I have Roland Kroebel. Roland, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Sure. Thank you, Kara. Thanks for the invite and welcome everybody. Sharing my presentation here, and I'll join these slides with Margot Hurlbert, who will come after me. But I'll give a quick introduction to agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions. So just to give you a basic understanding, global energy balance, only a third of the sunlight that's incoming is reflected, and 2/3 of the incoming sunlight is stored as heat. And you can see this with the yellow arrows. And the red arrows is basically the heat that is re-emitted from the surface. And some of it is lost to space, but there is a layer of greenhouse gases that actually reflects it back. And so that has an important function, because if we didn't have any GHG in the atmosphere, we would have a planetary average temperature of minus 18 degrees Celsius, not a very pleasant environment to live in. But the trouble is too that as we're adding greenhouse gases, more heat is reflected back. And what a timely thing to say in this current heat wave. So for Canada's GHG budget in 2019, it was calculated to be 730 megatons of CO2 equivalents. CO2 equivalence is a way to basically equalize how you account for the different greenhouse gases that are emitted, CO2 as well as nitrous oxide and methane. The goal of Canada is to reach under 502 megatons of CO2 equivalents by 2030. Not a whole lot of time to go. And the direct emissions from agriculture account to about 8%. So this doesn't include indirect emissions. I'll get back to that. But just in general, The livestock operations do contribute slightly more than the cropping operations, and that is partially due to the emissions that result from manure management. In Alberta, the picture changes a bit because Alberta has a huge footprint from energy production. And so the Alberta energy-related emissions make up basically a third of Canada's total GHG budget. And less than 1.5% of that energy is agriculture related, so basically transport or electricity consumption. And this 1.5% includes also forestry related activities. The Alberta agriculture contributes about 2.5% of the Canadian total greenhouse gas emissions, edging up to close to 3% if you account for the energy consumption. But in terms of the provincial budget, agriculture does contribute about the same amount, roughly 8% of the Alberta total. And here, livestock contributes 11.2 megatons of CO2 equivalents, and that is mostly enteric methane from beef cattle and dairy. But also manure that includes then pork and poultry emissions. And the cropping emissions amount to roughly 6.5 megatons of CO2 equivalents. That includes direct and indirect N2O emissions as the major contributor, but does not account for soil carbon change. And with this, I'll hand it over to Margot.
Thank you, Roland. Yes, I'm going to speak a little bit about policy and climate change. So first of all, as Roland pointed out, climate change, it's real, it's here. And this figure from NASA shows that we're actually already experiencing 1.1 degrees Celsius warming in 2020. Next slide. So we know from the IPCC 1.5 report that we need to reduce our carbon dioxide equivalents and in fact to net zero. And these figures are actually showing we may need to actually get into negative carbon dioxide equivalency. Our climate modeling at 1.5 report of the IPCC showed that it's going to be even more difficult to reach 2.2 degrees Celsius approaching 1.5. And we know even after the 2018 1.5 report that we're at dangerous thresholds of needing to reduce our emissions. And these thresholds are closer and closer, and there may be irreversible consequences. So we're headed for 3 degrees warming where we are now. So even though agriculture seems to be quite minor, we're in a serious situation and all hands are on the deck as we look at future heat waves, fires, and water scarcity. Next slide. So nearly 1,500 governments worldwide have declared a climate emergency. And what this figure is showing you is the countries that, in accordance with declaring a climate emergency, are in a net zero emissions rate by 2050, some of them even earlier that. And you can see Canada has joined in with its legislation that's tabled sitting at the Senate for net zero emissions. So we have kind of a sandwich going on here, next slide, where our federal government is starting to really push down from top to bottom carbon taxes and net zero requirements. And we're also knowing that urban and rural agriculture is really, really important. So the Land and Climate Report of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change in 2019 recognized there's lots of science that shows that we can make an incredible difference in greenhouse gas emissions with some policies that support a few measures that I'll just briefly cover. Some of them is demand management, dietary change, reducing the amount of waste and reducing the amount of food waste. So about 30% of our food supply chain ends up in waste, and that's 30% of the emissions. So if we can do some nudge policy to reduce this and change dietary patterns, we can be well ahead. We know that certain foods contain certain amounts of carbon. So if we can start labeling, certifying, and identifying carbon dioxide equivalents in our food, we can change consumer preferences. We know that local policies, land use zoning, can advance nature-based solutions. And the role of cities in our repertoire of entities that are taking on net zero challenges are just incredible and burgeoning. So buy local policies. We know that we don't have as much energy in shipping food if we're buying it local. So land use zoning in our cities to have green cities and reduce urban sprawl, very important. And very important in relation to heat waves with having green spaces that are able to reduce heat experienced in city centers. And payment for ecosystem services and nature's contribution. The Intergovernmental Panel for IPBES and the IPCC, sorry to give you all of these acronyms, are really working in the area of what is nature's contribution and how can we make sure these are valued appropriately. So thank you.
Hi there. So I believe I'm speaking next. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen, if that's okay. Unless the hosts... okay, here we go. Oh, sorry, I don't have this on... sorry, give me a second. I don't have this on slideshow mode. Always a hiccup with something. There we go. Okay, there we go. So, yeah, hi. Thanks for having me, and sorry for that minor delay there. I'm Robert. I'm currently between finishing a postdoc in the US at Rutgers and starting a work with a independent research organisation in Australia called CISAR. I'm currently speaking to you from a quarantine hotel in Sydney at 3 in the morning, but that's okay because I've been in the country less than 24 hours, so I'm still on North American time. So yeah, I was asked today to speak about a specific paper that I wrote as part of my PhD that was published in 2019, specifically looking at sustainability and yields in urban agricultural systems. The focus of this wasn't directly on greenhouse gas emissions, but it looked at sustainability and trade-offs involved in that. So it's quite relevant to this discussion, and I have some additional insights about greenhouse gases that might be relevant going forward. So this paper that I was specifically asked to talk about, that's its title at the top of the screen there. And in this paper, we followed a sample of urban gardeners in Sydney, Australia, over a period of 1 year. We followed these gardeners using logbooks that we asked the gardeners to keep, as well as various on-site assessments. And with this, what we tracked was the outputs from the garden in terms of these gardens, in terms of edible produce. And we also tracked all the inputs they provided, so primarily materials and labour. We then assessed the trade-offs involved in the production of this output, this edible food, using both conventional economic cost-benefit analysis, as well as something referred to as energy analysis, which is a type of embodied energy analysis. So what we found just at the basic level of what the gardeners were producing was that they were highly productive in terms of their output of food crops per area of land. On average, they produced just under 6 kilos of produce per square metre, which is around twice what typical rural fruit and vegetable farms in Australia produced. And what was particularly impressive about this number was that the gardeners did it without really even trying. Most of them didn't have anything in the way of formal horticultural qualifications, and we asked them about their motivations for gardening. We gave them these 9 possible reasons they might engage in urban food production, and asked them to rate the importance of each of them on a 1 to 5 scale. And as you can see, the lowest ranked one is the third one along, which is reduced food costs. That was kind of our proxy measure for producing lots of food. And as you can see, that was far less important on average than things like environmental goals through things like sustainable food and other environmental measures, as well as social and recreational goals. So ultimately, these gardeners were producing a whole lot of food without really aiming to do so. However, while the actual yield per square metre was pretty impressive, the trade-offs required to achieve that yield paint a less positive picture of how effective urban agriculture can be. The cost-benefit ratio was just 0.62. So effectively what that means is that for each dollar invested in these gardens in the form of materials and labour, the gardeners only ended up harvesting 62 cents worth of produce. However, we did also analyse this when assumed labour costs were removed, given that the gardeners kind of acted like this was a recreational activity for them. And when these were removed, we found that gardeners produced around $2.81 of produce for each dollar of materials invested. We assessed sustainability using a measure referred to as the environmental loading ratio. This is a metric often used in energy analysis to assess the sustainability of a system based on the proportion of renewable versus non-renewable impacts used in the system. And a level at 5.82 is generally considered moderate, something to have a moderate impact. So probably not gardeners who were highly motivated by environmental factors were aiming for. So after we found this relatively high environmental impact, we went looking at why this might be. And the fairly obvious answer was that, once we looked at all our data, was that a large proportion of the materials used were non-renewable. Non-renewable in energy analysis has a slightly different meaning to in general parlance. What it more or less means in this is a material is any substance that's being produced specifically for use in this, or is being consumed by it by the process you're examining. So for example, rainwater falling on a plot is renewable because it falls whether it happens there or not, and it's not consumed by the fact that it falls on a plot. But water taken from a municipal supply is considered non-renewable, as it's effectively a resource that's being treated and processed and then ultimately used specifically in this system. But what we realized was a lot of the non-renewable materials used in these gardens could potentially be sourced renewably in the urban environment. The urban waste stream in particular is a great source of things like wastewater and organic material that could be really valuably used in gardens. So what we did, we came up with a hypothetical scenario for these gardens, which we referred to as the maximum substitution scenario, where every non-renewable resource that could potentially be sourced within 2 kilometres of the gardens in a sustainable fashion, so taken from the municipal waste stream or something like that, was so substituted and replaced with a renewable resource. So I used the example of water already. We assumed that gardeners who used municipal water supplies would instead swap to capturing rainwater, which there's an abundance of in Australian cities anyway. It kind of just falls on the roofs and runs into the gutters. We also looked at things like we assumed gardeners propagated their own seedlings on site and used on-site soil amendments like compost, mulch instead of purchasing these. What we ultimately found under the maximum substitution scenario was that the environmental loading ratio dropped from 5.8 to 1.32, which is very good. That's considered quite sustainable in most MEG analyses and is substantially more sustainable than almost all other farming systems looked at. So just to wrap up my brief discussion about the sustainability of urban agriculture, what we've found is that ordinary people gardening just for the enjoyment of it can produce large quantities of food on what would otherwise be unproductive land. We're not looking at land that's being cleared specifically for agriculture. We're looking at land that's already been cleared and is in a relatively degraded state and putting it to this good use. And a companion paper to the one I've just discussed actually that we produced showed that Sydney has the space to produce around 15% of its food supply if grown at the rate of the gardeners in our study by using street verges, vacant lots, and around 25% of backyard space. So an MEG analysis showed that the way gardeners who are the subject of our study practice their gardening is environmentally unsustainable despite their intentions, but that there's significant potential to improve the sustainability of these gardens if done well. And if this happens, urban agriculture could potentially make a major contribution to food supplies in many cities. And thank you. That's where I'll wrap up and hand over to the next speaker.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is certainly a fascinating discussion so far. So I'd like to begin by underscoring that very little in the food system sustainability space is simple, and very often our assumptions turn out to be wrong. Now, in part, this is because modern food systems are embedded in complex supply chains, and they can impact on the environment in different ways, in different places, and to different extents. So to be effective in the food sustainability space, we really need to be thinking and acting at a systems level when we entertain potential solutions. So we already know that food systems and food policies looking forward will be influential in the degree of success that we ultimately have in mitigating climate change. Some of you may have read this article that was published in the journal Science last fall by Michael Clark and colleagues. Beyond their very sobering conclusions regarding the scope of the challenge that we face, they also identify, based on a synthesis of best available research, the key pathways that are at our disposal to reduce food system emissions. Interestingly, a lot of the popular discourse regarding the potential benefits of urban or small-scale agriculture stem from the widespread notion that local food is advantageous because it reduces transport-related emissions. In reality, this really isn't supported by evidence when we look at food systems as a whole. Transport-related emissions tend only to be important for things like horticultural products, which are typically low emissions to begin with, or for air-freighted food products, which fortunately are relatively uncommon in our food system. So for this reason, when we look at the 5 pathways proposed by Clark and colleagues, reducing food system transport emissions through co-locating production and consumption doesn't make the list. But we should reflect on the potential role of urban agriculture or small-scale rural farms to support each of these pathways. And here there are some arguments to be made. So for example, could urban agriculture help or hinder achieving food waste reduction objectives or support more plant-rich diets? Now, with respect to the 5th objective here, we once again need to be very cautious about our assumptions. Much of the scientific literature actually suggests that more intensive food production systems tend to be more resource efficient and with lower emissions, but there's a lot of heterogeneity, both within and between systems that are producing similar products. The conventional wisdom of economies of scale may not always hold, right? Bigger is not necessarily better. Now, unfortunately, comparable research of smaller scale rural or urban food systems is pretty limited. And what we do have provides mixed evidence with respect to potential sustainability benefits or trade-offs. But maybe one of the more important questions we need to deal with here is, well, how much food can alternative systems like urban or small-scale ag contribute to meeting actual demand for food? For small-scale rural agriculture, I think there are no obvious barriers provided efficiency objectives can be realized. With respect to urban agriculture, we really do need to think about the potential space constraints. So total urban area globally is about 2.8% of total agricultural land area. So assuming, some reasonable fraction of green space could be devoted to highly productive agriculture, the actual potential to meaningfully contribute to satisfying global demand for food would nonetheless be relatively small. And so the associated resource and environmental sustainability benefits, if there would be benefits, would be similarly small. On the other hand, there are a whole variety of important social sustainability benefits that may be associated with urban or small-scale agriculture that shouldn't be overlooked in our conversations regarding what good food systems ultimately look like. That said, trying to reconcile both climate and social sustainability objectives may well create irreconcilable trade-offs. Now, one last consideration I'd like to throw out here is that when we talk about urban agriculture, we tend to think about, that traditional community or backyard gardening approach. Less well understood, but perhaps more interesting with respect to potential contributions to food availability looking forward, is high intensity vertical farming of horticultural products at the peripheries of cities. If operating using renewable energy, these kind of systems could potentially have important sustainability as well as food security benefits. So that's it for me. I look forward to our discussions.
Awesome. Thank you all very much. If you guys can turn on your cameras and your microphones, we will get right into the panel discussion. So right off here on the bat, question for Nathan is, when it comes to your the vertical farming you were just talking about, what is the #1 reason right now you see that's kind of hindering the adoption of vertical farming in Canada?
In Canada specifically?
Yeah.
Our climate would be one major one. And also, availability of renewable energy. So anywhere where you have to heat greenhouse space, you're going to take a huge hit from a climate perspective unless you're operating entirely on the basis of renewable energy. That said, if we look at the Lower Mainland in British Columbia, we already have a significant greenhouse industry where exogenous heating is not a big deal because most of the year our climate is pretty darn suitable, right? So in areas like that, there are clearly opportunities. Most of our country is frozen solid 6 months of the year. So heating demands would be huge.
Absolutely. Okay, and another question coming in here, is urban agriculture a viable means of good production on a meaningful scale? This is one that could be opened up to any of you guys.
So I'll jump in if no one else is going to. From the work I've done in this, I would say the answer is yes from a scientific perspective, but currently no from a social perspective. I mentioned briefly in my talk, like the companion paper where we looked at the amount of space available in Sydney, which is a relatively kind of sprawling city. But still, we looked at the space available on that and figured we could produce about 15% of the city's total food supply on 25% of yard space and some other areas at the rate that gardeners were working on. The issue would be that's really not what people are used to doing in their gardens. Like we worked out if you had some kind of professional urban agriculture workforce, they could probably produce like I said, 15% of the food supply in the city, but that would involve substantial social changes about use and ownership of private land. And I think they're a bigger challenge than the space and the resource issues that in my perspective.
So to follow up, Robert, is there any recommendations or any ways you're seeing that social space being able to change?
Not on the scale that it would be big enough. Like I'm seeing cities throughout the world implementing community garden policies and urban agriculture policies and that type of thing. I know Toronto is quite keen on using like hydro corridors and such for this kind of space, but that's really the spaces that are kind of under government control are really in most cases a minority of the available spaces, and in most cases it's private space, and so we need, I guess, the social change that will allow that to be used for the common good, really, to make a meaningful contribution.
Absolutely. Would you like to add to that, Roland?
I just want to bring an example here from Lethbridge. We met a fellow who was endeavoring into farming the city landscape of Lethbridge. So he would take people's front lawns and plant them with beans and potato. However, the difficulty in the talk he gave was that his land was very small in each parcel and very distributed throughout the city. So he was essentially talking about planning to downscale at least the spread of his operation because it wouldn't pay for him to do it. Now, what I wanted to jump onto though is the question, well, even if we do farm all this area, unless we have a professional, say, agricultural production workforce, the whole question of sustainability becomes a bit of an issue in terms of we find it hard enough to ask farmers who do this on an everyday basis to ask how much nitrogen did you specifically apply to a certain field and a certain crop. They know on a farm average, but not necessarily for a specific crop. And this is basically professional people that know how much nitrogen their crop needs. Now, in any city operation, who would know how much nitrogen your lettuce actually uptakes? And that is basically, again, the whole question of applying nitrogen forces nitrous oxide emissions, forces climate change.
Absolutely. Margot, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, somewhat related to the two questions, so I might skip around a little bit. But I sense that Nathan is speaking about vertical agriculture, vertical farming, which is a whole new imaginative space. And Robert's speaking about what I think of as traditional community gardening in regular garden plots. And I think we're missing imagination, and we're missing interdisciplinarity. So when I listen to Nathan, I get excited. I'm kind of sitting in a greenhouse here because there's so much potential, even in places in Canada where we're not in southern Okanagan like Nathan is, and we don't have those types of access to resources. But what we do have is potential in technology to have more greenhouses, but we don't have the imagination because we're so used to our power being provided by an electric utility who's interested in providing us power, not heat. So if we use our imagination around cogeneration and the possibility of that for a remote or rural community, that could have a cogeneration facility for both their electricity, but also for applications such as greenhouses. If we use that, and if we change Robert's definition of sustainability in not importing soils, et cetera, because to do this type of agriculture in the north over permafrost, we're going to need a bit of imagination. So I think it's imagining this new future of, some people are calling it a circular economy, more local production, but also paying very much attention to what Roland is speaking about, which is accounting for carbon dioxide equivalents. And what Robert's speaking about is urban gardeners, a lot of it's a hobby for us. We're not paying a lot of attention to that. So we need to improve our practices in our carbon dioxide equivalent accounting. So I don't know, Robert and Nathan, if you want to take stabs at each other, because I think you're speaking past each other.
I don't feel like we are. I think often when we have conversations around, well, what does a sustainable food system look like? We tend to champion particular things. But in reality, I mean, a good system, a resilient system is diverse and has contributions from every viable alternative, right? But to pick up on Margot and Roland's points, absolutely. I mean, we have to be rigorous in our accounting of potential sustainability impacts and benefits. We have to take a multi-criteria approach because there are all kinds of valued outcomes we want from our food systems, and different ways of producing food in different contexts and at different scales are inevitably going to create trade-offs with respect to these different things that we value, right? It's really where we're going to get all of our ducks to line up. So we have to start by saying, well, what do we want? We have to be rigorous in measuring how these systems actually perform. And we have to be able to articulate why we prioritize some things over another. Otherwise, we'll never make consistent, justifiable decisions.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think there's really debate about whether should we have small community gardens or high-tech vertical farms. I mean, I guess if we were suddenly to start society again with the technology we have today, I don't think we'd have farming that would look anything like we have now. I think vertical farms would be kind of the way we go about producing our food. Totally, but as it is, we're working with what we've got now, and we're working with what we can do now, and it's a lot easier now for a city to start encouraging people to grow food on street verges and that type of thing, than it is to set up a massive indoor vertical farming industry as well. But no, I think they're both important parts of whatever solution we end up finding, if we find one. So yeah.
So we have an interesting comment here. It brings up a good point. This lady says, many of us, especially seniors who are on limited income, would like help. However, ironically, the produce produced by Canadian farmers who are adhering to carbon reduction guidelines is more expensive than that brought in from outside sources. How do you level that playing field? Anyone have any thoughts?
I mean, I'll jump in again if no one else is. Speaking a little bit outside my area of expertise, but I feel this is where policy areas like I believe the EU is considering implementing carbon border taxes some quite soon to bring in to tax produce coming from countries that don't, in their view, adequately manage carbon emissions. So something like that, if it were to be adopted worldwide, would certainly go quite some way to solving these problems. But that's a much easier said than done.
That said, we have to be really careful, with the assumption that producing something locally is more climate friendly, because most of the time, how a food is produced, how efficient, the degree of emissions associated with producing that food in a particular context are going to outweigh the transport related emissions. And it's here, I think, where urban agriculture is potentially interesting, because if we look at the proportion of transport related emissions for different food products, horticultural products generally have low emissions, so the transport fraction can be larger. And with long supply chains, we may have higher waste along those supply chains, right? So there could be a climate argument from that perspective. But if we kind of look at a meta level, as a whole, the transportation component of food systems contributes quite a small fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions.
But I would argue that those transportation systems calculations are in relation to the current price of carbon internationally. And as more and more countries start pricing carbon appropriately, and Canada is actually being lauded as one of the examples that could be followed in establishing a base carbon price federally, which the provinces can themselves either use the federal system or come up with their own. So it's an incredible system to actually start pricing carbon. And if we were to actually price the cost of fossil fuels that a lot of this transportation of agricultural produce is relying on, and internalize all the externalities in our fossil fuels, then that transportation calculation would change. And also, if we took the food waste, so I was saying 30%, and I think, Nathan, you have the same statistic. Food waste, we think of it as the food we're throwing out from our fridge and our plates, but there's incredible loss of food in our system, because when you watch what happens with produce and crops, they end up actually in shipper containers in the ocean waiting for purchase, right? So we've got this incredible food system, but it's also where a lot of this waste is happening. So if we can actually, what I think Robert was saying, account for the externalities, both in the food waste, but also in the carbon pricing of the transportation, I think we would see a very different food system in the future.
Absolutely. Anyone else have any other thoughts? No? Okay, then we'll move on to the next thought. This is kind of staying around this whole social adoption of urban agriculture. And this question says, perhaps one of the biggest impacts that urban ag could have is more personal awareness of greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of our foodstuffs. Do we have any comments on policies that could help drive some of this? Margot, you're nodding your head, so maybe you have some thoughts.
Roland, do you want to start and then I'll go?
Or generally, yes, I wholeheartedly agree. Urban farming is an awesome education opportunity, and I think many people should try and make use of it. With respect to greenhouse gas emissions, I always say if only nitrous oxide was a pink gas, because then we could actually see it, and it would be very easy to account for it. The unfortunate thing is that it isn't, and it's actually really difficult to measure. Even if you know all the other elements, or basically if you can measure N2O directly, you can measure all other elements of the nitrogen cycle, but it's actually really, really difficult. And it's something that we scientists do struggle with still, to try and figure out what is the exact quantities and how can we possibly model it or estimate it better than we do so far. So with that respect, to say, certainly if that was of interest, say I could come and talk about how nitrous oxide is formed, but you would probably not see this in your backyard.
And I'll tag team with Roland. You're gonna know he and I work together. We even share slides together. If we could do more citizen science in urban agriculture, so we've started to do it in a lot of contexts with water quality, with climate and weather. So if we could start doing some citizen science with the urban agriculture, and even include some of these cooperative gardens that are going up in our vulnerable and poor areas of the city where we've got gardens that people are sharing. But if we could actually advance the science and understanding of carbon dioxide equivalents, I think we would be able to engender a kind of bottom-up understanding and movement around carbon dioxide equivalents that's needed in the agricultural sector and in the urban agricultural sector for sure.
Nathan or Robert, anything you'd like to add?
I'm skeptical about there being automatic climate benefits, but I think if we think about sustainability more broadly, there are all kinds of really good reasons to promote urban agriculture. In particular, given that many urban residents really have very little connection with nature, right, with the natural world. And just being able to connect in some tangible way to something that contributes meaningfully and immediately to your well-being, I think it's healthy psychologically and spiritually. And I think it creates that bridge to thinking about your relationship to the natural world a little bit more than you might otherwise have living in a concrete jungle.
Absolutely. And of course, Roland, go ahead.
One thing that I picked up from Robert was on this attempt to say, like, how can we make this urban farming more sustainable? And you had a good point in there, because urban centers are recipients of both water and sunlight. And so what we do right now with that is essentially nothing. That water just falls on the city, goes down the storm drain, and is gone. The same with the sunlight. It heats up our streets and the buildings to some extent. Mostly we suffer from it. But other than that, we don't really do much with it. And what we also do is we export a ton of nutrients from the surrounding landscape into the city, and it ultimately gets dumped. And so one of the interests on my side is they talking about urban farming is the question, well, can we actually make use of these resources that we have in the city?
That's a very good point, particularly with respect to cycling nutrients, right? Because producing the nutrients that are used in agriculture is a major driver of energy use and emissions. And if we can find ways to efficiently close those nutrient cycles, we can make large gains.
Yeah, and this was something that was is covered in the companion paper to the one I was discussing. Is we looked at the available roof water within Sydney, and it far exceeds the amount that would be needed just at a local level, at like a block by block level. The amount of rain falling on rooftops, so the easiest to catch water, this isn't including the water falling on streets and such, yeah, far exceeds the amount that would be needed for urban agriculture on the scale we envisioned it in those blocks. Same as organic waste in the municipal waste stream. Once again, block by block, that exceeds what we predict you'd need for to turn highly degraded urban soils into relatively productive farmable soils. Once again, the quantity of that available in the waste stream exceeds what would be needed, and really you want to take as much out of the waste stream as possible anyway. So it kind of feels like a win-win if you can remove something from the waste stream and use it for production. So I think cities are a good in that sense for farming, and that they have plenty of those things that you need that are just otherwise going to waste.
And Robert, did you look at policy and infrastructure for capturing the water? And I know there's some cities that are doing composting programs with their recycling and waste programs?
Yeah, so I didn't focus on policy in great detail, but we did this. I mean, that was why we focused just on roof water, just so that it doesn't really require much in the way of sophisticated infrastructure. All you need is a rainwater tank that in Australia, many cities are trying to push out anyway, regardless of urban agriculture, just to make use of this water and to put less demand on municipal supplies. Which often come from catchments that ironically get less rainfall than the cities themselves, just because of the way our cities are arranged all around the coast. So I didn't look at the infrastructure in detail, but there certainly are already policy drives going towards this most basic form of rainwater capture. I didn't look at the composting infrastructure, but I know that's also a thing that there are cities around the world trying to move on to just because of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with putrescible waste. They're trying to move into municipal composting programs and that type of thing, and separated bins for green waste. So yeah, it's something that's coming unrelated to urban agriculture, and if it were tied to urban agriculture, that might help push it along perhaps.
May I also ask Robert a quick question?
Absolutely.
I was really struck by your finding that yields from backyard gardens in cities were so high compared to industrial producers, which ostensibly are supported by a history of research and development, right? Land grant universities, all that stuff. Can you hypothesize as to why that might be the case?
Yeah, I would say it's basically more efficient use of space due to manual versus machine labor. So I've just come from my position at Rutgers working in these huge orchards where the trees only cover about 40% of a 1 hectare orchard. You only have about 0.4 hectares actually covered by trees, and that's not really a horticultural constraint. That's a management constraint because you need tractors to get between them to spray and do all that other stuff. So yeah, really, I think that's the main thing. So that's really the main thing going for it, as well as a little bit of like more diverse cropping resulting in over yielding. But that basically means that if it's something that you were going to scale up, you'd kind of need to keep scaling it up in this kind of patchwork way that allows manual management instead of machine-based management.
Now, of course, when we're talking about all this, another thing that often comes to people's minds is cost. A question here, does any of this reduce the cost to the working class consumer of food? Or in the end, is it all going to increase costs and labor? Does anyone have any breakdown on that? No? No. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a great answer, but I'll briefly touch on that. Yeah, we did find that the costs of, I don't remember the exact figures off the top of my head, but about 75% of the diversity of crops we saw harvested were more expensive to produce them in an urban setting as distinct from buying them from a retailer. I guess what's interesting is that the 25% or so that were cheaper tend to be quite high value niche products. So there is potentially, I guess this is moving away a bit from the urban agriculture as a big provider. But yes, when you're talking about kind of obscure niche products, it can be a cheaper way of doing them, just because I guess a lot of the cost of purchasing them commercially is the fact that, they have to be, probably we're getting into shipping here, shipped from the one obscure farmer who grows this one obscure crop, and they can charge a premium on it because they've got the market cornered and that type of thing. So for certain crops, it will reduce costs, but as it's currently practiced, no, it's probably more expensive in most cases.
I may chip in, and that's basically personal experience from our own backyards. We do try to do a bit of farming there. And there are certainly expensive ways of doing backyard farming, and there's cheaper ways to do it. And it depends on essentially what kind of inputs you're buying for this. There's one way, for instance, where I could go to the construction market or some market that sells compost, and I buy the compost to put on my plants or my soil. But I actually did build my own little compost and realized how much biomass we carry off every year as yard waste. And so maybe I don't need to do this. I can compost it myself and then offset the costs that I would have otherwise for the compost. And by the way, also the nutrients. Then again, things like question would be, do you seed yourself? Because the seeds are usually cheaper than buying the ready plants. And with buying already grown plants, say you always carry the risk with it that if it fails, then you have basically a cost that didn't result in a yield. While with the seeding, you can come off a lot cheaper. There's seed sharing with other people. I don't know whether your local town has a seed sharing bank where you can get stuff like that. And then depends, again, yes, as Robert said, like depends on what you actually grow. In my case, I do buy my Okanagan cherries for the summer consumption, but I do have 2 Evans cherries trees in the backyard, which will make wonderful cherry juice for the winter.
That's great. Absolutely. So we got a question here for Robert. Sorry to put you back on the hot seat here, Robert. Who are the recipients or customers for the products of the small gardens you studied? How would this work affect lower income people in a city?
So yeah, so most of the gardens I worked with were for personal production, but there were a few that were kind of veggie box schemes where they rely on people would have a subscription and they get a weekly delivery of local seasonally produced vegetables. Once again, that was probably a more expensive way of buying vegetables than getting them from the local supermarket. But I know that the organizations that were involved in that kind of considered a social enterprise, like they made a point of employing young people from disadvantaged backgrounds and that type of thing, and their customers were kind of aware of that and considered their purchase not just a grocery purchase, but also I guess investment in the social mission of these programs.
Okay, sounds good. Another question here in regards to backyard gardens. I don't know if anyone's going to have a comment on this, but maybe you will. There's a question here that says, I would be willing to have someone else create one in my backyard since I don't feel I have the energy to tend to one myself. Does anyone know of any programs which matches potential urban gardeners with persons such as myself with gardening space? Is there anything like that out there right now? Anyone know?
I only know that my time limit is my own backyard. Like
I have heard of programs like that, you know, specific to place. I think there's a program like that in the city of Victoria, for example. But with respect to policy, you know, there's a place for policymakers to play a role in, you know, supporting the development of those kind of programs.
Yeah, I know there's a couple of businesses that have existed in places. I know there was one in Portland, Oregon going for a while that would basically, where a farmer would come in, farm in your backyard, give you some of the produce as, I guess, as the rent on it, and then sell some of the produce elsewhere. They're fairly niche businesses though, and I'm not sure how well they're doing generally. But that's the closest thing that I'm aware of to that.
Absolutely. And for this person asking the question, I'd recommend you just look into your local areas as well. If you're in a bigger center, you may have that option for sure. So another question here is, how should we be thinking about / approaching comparisons of the sustainability of food produced in different contexts and at different scales and levels of intensity? So we're all in different areas. How do we approach that?
I took a stab at addressing that earlier on. Like, I think we have to begin with being clear about what do we want out of our food systems, right? Is low greenhouse gas emissions a priority? If so, what are we willing to trade off to achieve that, right? Is cheap food a priority? I mean, I think historically that has been a major motivating force that has really determined a lot of what our current food system looks like, with some very real benefits and some very real downsides as well. One thing maybe we don't think about when we have these conversations around different food systems is, well, what diets would they actually support, and can we live with that? I mean, we can imagine any number of configurations for food systems, but what they would actually provide and at what levels would differ very widely. So here in the Okanagan, where I live, for example, there's a very strong local food movement, but I rarely hear anyone reflecting on what an Okanagan-based diet would look like in summer versus in winter, and whether or not that would be desirable or acceptable, and for what share of the population. So our current food system here in Canada, it's of a very particular type, and it's the outcome of a variety of historical forces as well as geographical realities. And one important geographical reality is that we produce a lot of grains and livestock because we have vast prairies that are suitable for grain production. We don't produce a lot of the horticultural products we consume because, as I mentioned earlier, it's winter for much of the year in much of the country, so it doesn't really support that kind of production. Now, small-scale rural agriculture can certainly produce a lot of the same things that large-scale rural agriculture does, but it might be less amenable to supporting, the degree of highly processed foodstuffs that we currently consume, because this requires an efficient flow of raw materials to processors, which might be good for a whole variety of reasons. With urban agriculture, I mean, there are some constraints with respect to, well, what diets can urban agriculture support? We're just not going to grow grains or raise livestock to any appreciable degree in cities, but we could produce substantially potentially a large share of horticultural products. So a food system with that emphasis, would be more amenable to supporting a plant-centric diet. But again, we really need to layer in, I think, what do we want out of our food systems? What kind of diets are acceptable? At what cost and with what trade-offs?
There was actually a book written, I believe they came out of BC, Elias and McKinnon, that wrote the 100-Mile Diet. And it was really fascinating. And some of my friends and colleagues in Saskatchewan have tried this, which is if you were to have only to eat for a year food produced within 100 miles, what would it look like? So thinking in those terms opens up a whole new way of looking at the food system, like Nathan is speaking about. We also have restaurants in Saskatchewan that only use local food for their dishes, which is an interesting experience in and of itself. As Nathan says, it's very hard to be vegetarian in a Saskatchewan or Alberta context for a 365-day-a-year locally produced diet.
Absolutely. So we are running out of time very quickly. It always goes by so fast, but I'll let you guys, does anyone have any closing remarks they'd like to make before we wrap up here? No, we're all good? Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. Be sure our next upcoming webinar is actually pretty much a month from now. It is on July 28th. You will receive, if you signed up for this webinar, you will receive an invite in the upcoming weeks. And the topic will be on measuring food's environmental impacts. So that will be another great one to be a part of. But thank you all for being a part of this today. We can't have this conversation without you. So we appreciate it very much. And if you missed parts of this conversation, this will get sent to you in your email, the full recording. And as I said at the beginning, check out our YouTube page and we will, you'll be able to find all past recordings. So thanks everyone and have yourselves a great rest of the week. And if you're in Western Canada, stay cool.
Thank you.